If the heat goes out, the kids in that gym won't have all night. Grant Mercer said it quietly, the same way he said everything, like a man who had spent years learning that panic only made bad situations worse. 10 minutes earlier, he had been kneeling on the elementary school cafeteria floor, tightening the loose wheel on Sadie's trifold science board while she practiced her presentation for the 4th time. Her project was called Safe House during a winter blackout, and she had built it out of cardboard, silver foil, and 2 crooked cotton ball clouds she insisted looked like real storm fronts over Indiana. Grant told her they looked perfect. He always said that first, then fixed whatever needed fixing with his hands while she smiled like she believed him more than the weather report. Outside, the wind had started to rise, pushing dry snow across the parking lot in thin white lines. Inside, the school still smelled like burnt coffee, wet coats, and poster paint. Sadie tugged his sleeve and asked if he'd still be there when her turn came. Grant looked at the old watch on his wrist, then at the maintenance text buzzing on his phone, then back at his daughter's face. He touched the inhaler tucked in the side pocket of her backpack before answering. "I'll be back before you start, Peanut. I promise." That was when Naomi Whitaker stepped into the hallway in a camel coat that probably cost more than Grant's pickup truck, followed by a principal, a board member, and a woman carrying a tablet. She was the kind of woman who made people stand straighter without raising her voice. The school district loved her because her company had just funded the new emergency warming wing. Parents loved her because she looked calm enough to fix problems just by noticing them. Grant had seen her face on local business magazines in the grocery checkout line. Up close, she looked even more controlled. When he asked, as evenly as he could, whether Sadie could stay in the heated faculty lounge if the storm got worse because cold air sometimes triggered her breathing, Naomi barely looked at him before glancing at the tablet in her assistant's hand. "That area is reserved for approved families and district guests," she said. Not cruel, not loud. Somehow worse because it sounded administrative. Final. Grant felt Sadie go. Still beside him. "I'm not asking for special treatment," he said. "I'm asking for a warm room for my little girl if the power flickers." Naomi finally met his eyes then, and what she saw was a work jacket, worn boots, a tired single father trying not to sound desperate in a building full of people richer than he was. "The rules are there for a reason, Mr. Mercer." Sadie looked down at her science board, at the paper windows she had cut out so carefully, and whispered, "It's okay, Dad." Grant swallowed whatever else he might have said. He just nodded once, because fathers like him learned early that humiliation landed harder when your child was close enough to hear it. But as he picked up Sadie's backpack and felt the first hard slam of wind against the school windows, he looked past Naomi toward the glowing sign for the new warming wing and had one cold, certain thought he did not say out loud. If the backup failed tonight, that room would not stay warm for long. By the time Grant got Sadie home, the storm had turned mean. Snow did not fall anymore. It moved sideways, scraping across the duplex windows in long white sheets that made the whole street look like it was being erased one house at a time. He got her boots off at the door, hung her little purple coat by the radiator, and set a kettle on the stove before he even took off his own gloves. Routine first. Always routine first. Sadie knew the pattern. Inhaler on the counter. Humidifier checked. Extra blanket folded at the end of the couch. She sat cross-legged on the living room rug with her science board propped against a dining chair, using a marker to darken the words emergency heat loss on the last panel like it still mattered whether the letters were neat. Grant stood by the kitchen window, watching the streetlight bend in the wind, his phone in one hand and a flashlight in the other. The district had already sent 2 alerts. School activities canceled. Roads deteriorating. Shelter locations subject to change. Subject to change was the kind of phrase people with warm offices liked to use when they did not have to drive through. Weather like this with a child in the back seat. Sadie looked up at him and asked, very carefully, whether the lady from school had been mad at him. Grant turned from the window and shook his head. "No, baby." She was doing what people do when they think paper tells them more than people do. Sadie nodded like she understood more than a 9-year-old should. Then she pointed to her model house and said, "The problem is not when the power goes out. The problem is how fast the warm air leaves after." Grant looked at her for a second longer than usual. That is exactly the problem. The lights flickered once, then held. He did not like that. He liked it even less when he opened the outage map and saw a strange line of failures stacking across the east side in a pattern that was too clean to be random. That was when someone pounded on his front door, hard enough to rattle the thin glass beside it. Sadie jumped. Grant moved fast, not scared, just immediate. He crossed the room, checked the latch, and opened the door to a blast of snow and frozen wind that pushed a woman half a step into his porch light. Naomi Whitaker stood there with wet hair whipped loose from its clip, her expensive coat dusted white, and one bare hand clutching a small insulated medical pouch so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. She did not look like a chief executive now. She looked like a mother who had run out of good options. For one suspended second, neither of them spoke. Then Naomi swallowed, fighting for breath against the cold, and said the last thing Grant ever expected to hear from her. "My car died 3 blocks away. My son is stuck at the warming center, and I cannot reach him. Please." Grant did not ask why she had no driver, no assistant, no backup plan, no perfect system now. He just stepped back from the door and said, "Come in before you lose feeling in your hands." Naomi hesitated like she was not used to crossing thresholds she did not control. Then she stepped inside his small, warm house, and the storm came in with her. Naomi stood just inside the doorway, not moving, as if warmth itself had startled her. Melted snow slid from the hem of her coat onto Grant's worn floorboards in a thin dark line. Sadie looked up from the rug, took in the stranger, the storm, the tightness in the woman's face, and quietly pushed her own science board out of the way like she understood that real emergencies had just stepped into the room. Grant shut the door against the wind, locked it, and pointed to the kitchen table. "Sit down before your hands stop working." Naomi obeyed, which surprised both of them. He handed her a dish towel first, then a heavy gray blanket from the back of the couch. Sadie climbed to her feet and asked in the careful, practical voice children sometimes use when adults are trying too hard not to fall apart. "Is your son little?" Naomi swallowed before answering. "He is 10. Sadie nodded once. "I am 9. My dad makes grilled cheese when I am scared." Grant gave her a look that should have made her smile, but Naomi did instead, barely, for less than a second. It changed her whole face and disappeared just as quickly. Grant set a mug of hot tea in front of her, then pulled up the outage map on his phone again. The east side was getting worse. Not scattered failures. Layered ones. Circuit after circuit stepping down in a chain too neat to be weather alone. Naomi reached into the insulated pouch she had carried through the storm and checked the contents with shaking fingers. Vials. A glucose meter. Backup supplies. "My son is at the warming center on Delaney Street," she said. "The school sent families there when they started consolidating shelters." Grant looked up fast. "The old field house." Naomi nodded. Something in his expression hardened, not toward her, but toward the map, the storm, the whole invisible machine behind both. "That building should not be handling this load," he said. Naomi stared at him. "What do you mean should not?" He zoomed in on the outage clusters and said, more to himself than to her, "Because if the thermal bypass was removed from the east cluster retrofit, then the backup heat there is only buying time, not protection." Naomi sat very still. Sadie, from the rug, asked the question no adult in the room wanted to ask first. "Is her boy cold?" Naomi pressed her lips together before answering. "I do not know." Grant set the phone down, then crossed to the old junk drawer by the refrigerator and pulled it open. Naomi watched him sort through batteries, a church bulletin, a screwdriver, cough drops, and rubber bands until he found a worn stack of folded papers bound with a clip. He laid them on the table in front of her. At first Naomi only saw diagrams. Load paths, heat retention flows, emergency backup routing. Then she saw the logo in the corner. Whitaker Grid. Her company. And beneath that, on the original title sheet, a name stamped in faded black ink that had once been crossed out by somebody in legal. Grant Mercer. Naomi looked from the plans to the man standing across from her in a thermal work shirt and faded jeans, and for the first time that night, the storm outside no longer felt like the biggest thing closing in around her. Naomi did not touch the papers at first. She only stared at the name, then at Grant, then back at the diagrams as if the room had quietly shifted under her feet, and she was the last person to feel it move. The kettle hissed softly on the stove. Wind pressed a long, low sound against the windows. Sadie sat on the rug with her knees pulled to her chest, watching both adults with the kind of stillness children use when they know the truth in a room has changed shape. You worked for Whitaker Grid, Naomi said at last, but even she could hear how small the sentence sounded next to the stack of drawings in front of her. Grant leaned one hand on the back of a kitchen chair. Not for long enough to matter to the people who kept the logo. Naomi lifted the top page. The handwriting in the margins was dense, neat, specific. Thermal reroute tolerances. Emergency sequence notes. Risk flags marked in red. Her eyes stopped on one line and then went back to it again. If bypass assembly is removed, East Cluster loses survivable heat window under sustained sub-zero wind load. She looked up sharply. This was submitted? Grant gave a single nod. 3 times. And denied. Not denied. He said. Buried. Which is cleaner, if your goal is to say nobody ignored anything. Naomi sat back hard in the chair. She knew that voice now. It was not bitterness performed for sympathy. It was a man describing the exact shape of damage after he had already lived with it long enough to stop dressing it up. She asked the next question more quietly. Why did you leave? Grant looked towards Sadie before answering, as if every truth had to pass through the fact that his daughter was in the room. Because after my wife died, I stopped having patience for rooms full of people who called risk acceptable when the families carrying it would never be theirs. Naomi lowered her eyes. She had walked through hundreds of boardrooms, negotiated 8-figure deals, sat through presentations built to flatten disaster into percentages and legal exposure. But sitting in a duplex kitchen with damp gloves in her lap and a storm closing around the block, she suddenly saw what those polished rooms had trained people like her to miss. Not numbers. People. Warmth. Medicine. The space between a backup system on paper and a child breathing through the night. Her phone lit up in her hand with 1 week bar. A message came through late and incomplete from the warming center. Heat unstable. Staff requesting transfer guidance. Insulin refrigeration compromised if outage continues. Naomi made a sound Grant had not heard from her before. Not fear exactly. Worse. Recognition. She stood so fast the chair legs scraped the floor. Milo is there. I know, Grant said. And if that field house is running on the version they built instead of the version I designed, then they are on borrowed minutes. Naomi looked at the papers again, then at him. Can you fix it? Grant did not answer right away. He crossed to the counter, opened a narrow drawer beside the stove, and pulled out a sealed brown envelope with an old security stamp across the flap. He held it for a moment like it weighed more than paper should. Maybe, he said. But if I open this, your storm is not the only thing that is going to break tonight. Grant held the sealed envelope in one hand and looked past Naomi toward the living room, where Sadie had curled beneath the gray blanket with her science board leaning against the couch like a prophecy made out of cardboard and glue. That was the problem with old lives. They never stayed buried in neat places. They waited until your child was finally asleep in a warm house, and then came back asking for everything at once. Naomi followed his gaze and understood the hesitation before he explained it. If you can help my son, then help him, she said. But her voice had lost the clean authority it had worn at school. Now it sounded like what it really was. A mother bargaining with time. Grant did not open the envelope yet. He checked Sadie's breathing first. He always checked Sadie first. He crouched beside the couch, touched the back of her hand, adjusted the blanket at her shoulders, and made sure her inhaler was still within reach on the end table. Sadie blinked up at him, not fully sleepy anymore. Are you going somewhere? She asked. Grant gave her the kind of smile fathers use when they are already making a choice they wish they did not have to make. Maybe for a little bit. Sadie looked past him to Naomi, then back to the envelope in his hand. Because of her boy, she asked. Naomi lowered her head. Grant did not lie to his daughter. Yes. Sadie was quiet for a moment. Then she glanced at the model house she had built for the science fair and said, if the heat is unstable, he cannot stay there. Naomi closed her eyes once, briefly, as if a 9-year-old had just stripped every layer of distance off the crisis. Grant stood again and went to the kitchen counter where the outage map still glowed on his phone. The east cluster was bleeding capacity in a pattern he knew too well. He could picture the weak points without seeing them. The field house would be losing warmth faster than the staff understood, and the medical refrigeration would fail long before the room felt truly desperate to people who did not know what to watch for. Naomi stepped closer. Tell me what opening that envelope does. Grant let out a slow breath. It gives me access codes, override routing, and the original emergency authorization chain. Then open it. It is not that simple. He looked at her then, fully, and for the first time Naomi saw not only the calm in him, but the cost of it. If I open this, I put my name back inside your company's system. Once that happens, they will know exactly who built the version they cut apart. They will know who warned them. They will know who stepped in tonight. And people like your board do not lose quietly. Naomi wanted to say she would protect him, but the words died before they reached her mouth because both of them knew promises from people in power were only worth something after they had to pay for them. The house creaked in the wind. The lights flickered once and came back weaker. Then Sadie started coughing from the couch, dry and tight enough to pull Grant around instantly. He was beside her in 2 steps, hand on her back, voice low, steady, familiar. Naomi watched him count out the breaths, guide the inhaler, and settle his daughter without even a trace of panic crossing his face. That was when she finally understood the true shape of the decision in front of him. Helping her son might save Milo, maybe dozens of children in that field house. But leaving this house, in this storm, meant stepping away from the one child who depended on him more than anyone else in the world. Grant looked at Sadie, then at the sealed envelope, then at Naomi. Call your warming center again, he said. If the temperature in the insulin fridge drops below range, I go. If it has not yet, I still have a few minutes to decide whether I am about to save your son by putting my daughter through another night of waiting for me to come home. Naomi called the warming center on speaker because her hands were shaking too badly to hold the phone steady. The first 2 attempts failed. On the third, a tired voice answered over a wash of static and children crying somewhere in the background. Grant did not need the whole conversation. He only needed 4 words. The refrigerator is warming up. Naomi closed her eyes when she heard them. Grant did not. He moved. Once the decision was made, everything in him became smaller, faster, cleaner. He opened the brown envelope with one precise tear and slid out a laminated emergency credential, 2 folded access sheets, and a flash drive on an old metal key ring. Naomi stared at the badge, then at the date printed on it, and realized this part of his life had not ended because it was small. It had ended because it had cost too much to keep. Grant crossed to the hallway closet and pulled down his heavy coat, an old knit cap, and the orange weatherproof bag he used for school maintenance callouts. Flashlight, gloves, portable meter, hand warmers. He packed like a man who respected failure because he had seen how quickly it punished people who did not. Then he walked next door through the connecting side porch to Mrs. Alvarez, the retired night nurse who had watched Sadie twice before during snow closures. He came back a minute later with relief written nowhere on his face, only readiness. She will sit with Sadie if the power blinks again, he said. Sadie was already upright on the couch, blanket around her shoulders, eyes too wide to pretend she was not listening. Grant knelt in front of her and zipped her purple hoodie up to her chin. I need you to do exactly what Mrs. Alvarez says if I am not back before the street gets plowed. Sadie looked at the badge in his hand. Are you the only one who can fix it? Grant hesitated just long enough for the truth to matter. No, he said softly. But I am the only one close enough who knows what they took out. Sadie nodded like that answer hurt more because it was honest. Then she reached for his sleeve. Bring her boy home warm. Naomi turned away at that, one hand covering her mouth. Grant stood and headed for the door. Naomi followed immediately. I am coming with you. He stopped with his hand on the lock. No, my son is in that building. And if you come, you do exactly what I say when I say it. No boardroom voice. No executive instinct. No arguing with physics. Naomi looked at him through the dim kitchen light, every expensive layer of certainty stripped off by the storm until only the mother remained. Fine, she said. Just do not ask me to stay behind. Grant opened the door, and the wind hit them so hard it seemed to shove the whole night into the house at once. Snow whipped across the porch. The old pickup sat under a thick white crust, waiting. Naomi climbed in beside him without another word, clutching the insulin pouch against her chest while Grant turned the key and brought the engine to life. As the heater groaned awake and the wipers fought to carve 2 narrow windows into the white, Naomi looked at the papers in his lap and asked the question she had been avoiding since he opened that envelope. What happens if your company logs you back into the system tonight? Grant pulled the truck into the street and did not look at her when he answered. It is not my company, he said. And if I do this, by morning they will remember exactly whose name they buried. The truck crawled through the storm like it was moving underwater. Grant kept both hands on the wheel, shoulders steady, eyes fixed on the narrow path the headlights carved through the blowing white. Naomi had never ridden in a vehicle that felt so ordinary, while carrying something that felt this enormous. The heater blew lukewarm air. The dashboard rattled. Every few seconds the tires slipped half an inch before Grant corrected them with the calm of a man who had long ago accepted that control was never noise, only adjustment. Substation first, he said. If I can reroute the east cluster before the field house drops another 5 degrees, the refrigeration should stabilize. Naomi nodded, even though she knew he was not talking for her comfort. He was talking to keep the sequence clean in his own head. When they turned onto the service road, floodlights appeared through the snow like pale moons behind a veil. The substation fence rose out of the storm, steel and ice and warning signs, with 2 security vehicles parked outside the gate. Naomi felt her stomach drop before the truck had even stopped. They are already here, she said. Grant killed the engine and reached for the old credential badge. Of course they are. Companies always show up fastest when the truth might leave a record. He stepped out into the wind, and Naomi followed before he could tell her not to. A security guard met them at the gate, jacket zipped to his chin, flashlight beam bouncing in the snow. The man started with Naomi, because people like him always knew who power looked like. Ma'am, the site is under restricted control pending executive direction. Grant held up the badge, then opened the gate. The guard barely glanced at it before shaking his head. I have orders not to admit unauthorized personnel. Grant did not raise his voice. Read the line under my name. The guard did, and his whole posture changed just enough for Naomi to notice. Original Emergency Systems Architect. Manual Override Authority. The words seemed absurd beside the man standing in worn boots with snow caking the cuffs of his jeans, but the guard stepped back anyway, and keyed open the gate. Inside the control room, everything smelled like metal, dust, and overheated wiring. Red warning lights blinked across one whole panel bank. Naomi watched Grant move toward the console as if he had never really left it. No hesitation. No searching. He plugged in the old flash drive, entered a sequence from memory, and pulled up a system layer she had never seen in a single executive review. The original design. The design before the cuts. On the screen, the East Cluster failure map unfolded like a confession. There, Grant said, pointing to a bypass route hidden beneath the current operating model. That is what your board removed. That is why the field house is dropping heat faster than projected. Naomi stared at the lines and numbers and realized something so painful it felt almost personal. Grant was not improvising to save her son. He was restoring the exact protection her company had decided other people could live without. He entered the final command. For one long second, nothing happened. Then the control panel shifted from red to amber, then amber to green along the east line. Grant exhaled once, sharp and small. Heat is moving, he said. At that same moment, a new window flashed across the monitor in bright system text. Emergency override executed by original authorization holder, Mercer, Grant. Naomi looked at the name glowing on the screen, then at the man standing in front of it, and understood the price of what he had just done. He had not only saved her son, he had just walked back into the fireproof vault where her company had buried him and turned on the lights himself. By the time they reached the field house, the storm had eased just enough to reveal the damage it had been hiding. The parking lot was jammed with cars half buried in snow, families wrapped in blankets, volunteers moving with the slow, strained focus of people who had been making impossible things look manageable for too many hours. Grant parked near the side entrance, killed the engine, and sat for 1 second longer than Naomi expected. Not from fear, from calculation. He was already measuring what had changed since the heat came back online, what had not, and who would try to rewrite the story before daylight. Inside, the air was warmer than before, but not stable yet. You could feel it in the room. Not freezing. Not safe. Just recovering. A nurse at the folding medical table looked up the moment Naomi rushed in and said Milo's name. 30 seconds later, her son came running across the gym in borrowed socks and an oversized school hoodie, clutching a paper cup of apple juice with both hands. Naomi dropped to her knees and held him so tightly that Milo laughed once before realizing she was crying. Grant looked away and gave them that privacy like a man who understood what it meant when a parent finally got proof their child was still warm and breathing. Then the volunteer nurse crossed the room toward him with a clipboard and said, "Whoever restored the refrigeration just saved every temperature-sensitive supply we had left." Grant only nodded. Naomi stood, still holding Milo's shoulders, and turned to look at him fully. There, under fluorescent lights and the smell of wet coats and instant coffee, she saw the whole truth in a way she had not been forced to see it before. He was not a forgotten employee. He was not a man who used to matter. He was the reason this room had a future past midnight. Her phone started ringing before she could say any of that. Board counsel, then operations, then a senior vice president who had ignored her last 3 calls. Naomi answered one and listened in silence as a voice on the other end tried to package the night into legal language. Unauthorized access, emergency deviation, narrative control. She looked at Grant while the man kept talking, watched him pull out his phone to check on Sadie before he checked anything else, and something in her hardened the right way for the first time that day. "No," she said into the phone, clear enough that even the people nearest her went still. "You do not get to call the man who saved this building unauthorized." She listened another second, then cut them off again. "And if anyone in that boardroom plans to turn him into a liability shield by morning, they can start by putting my name next to his." Grant looked up at that, surprised despite himself. Naomi held his gaze, not asking for forgiveness, not claiming she had earned anything, just standing in the truth she should have stood in hours earlier. Milo tugged her sleeve and asked in a sleepy voice if they could go home. Naomi put one hand on his hair and said yes, but her eyes stayed on Grant, because they both knew home was no longer a simple word tonight. Grant had brought heat back to the building, but in doing it, he had reopened everything Whitaker Grid had buried. And as the first alerts about the override began hitting executive phones across the city, Naomi understood one final thing with painful clarity. Saving her son had been the easy part. Getting justice for the man she had once dismissed in front of his daughter was going to cost much more than a thank you. By sunrise, the storm had moved east, but nothing in Grant Mercer's life had gone back where it had been. He drove Naomi and Milo home in the same old pickup, heater rattling, windshield streaked with salt and thaw, while the radio murmured about emergency grid overrides and unnamed system failures across the county. Naomi sat in silence for most of the ride, one hand resting on her son's shoulder, the other wrapped around her phone as if it had become something heavier than glass. Every few minutes it lit up with another call from legal, another message from the board, another carefully worded attempt to drag the night back into the language of liability. Grant did not ask what they were saying. He already knew the shape of it. Men and women in warm offices were waking up to his name on their screens, and people like that never panicked about what almost happened to strangers. They panicked about who could prove they knew it might. When he finally pulled up outside Naomi's house, she did not reach for the door right away. She looked at him instead, really looked, as if the man she had judged in a school hallway the day before and the man who had saved her son in the middle of the night still refused to fit inside the same understanding. "I was wrong about you," she said quietly. Grant kept his hands on the wheel. That was not the expensive part. Naomi flinched because she knew he was right. Being wrong in private was one thing. Being wrong in a way that had nearly cost children their safety was something else entirely. Milo, half asleep in the back seat, lifted his head and asked if Sadie was okay. Grant said yes, she was home warm and resting. Then Milo asked the question neither adult wanted from a child because it was too clean to hide from. If he had not helped us, would they still have said everything was fine? Naomi closed her eyes. Grant looked out through the windshield at the pale morning light catching the edge of the snowbanks, and did not answer for her. A few hours later, after checking on Sadie, after making her oatmeal the way she liked it with too much cinnamon, after hearing Mrs. Alvarez say she had watched the news and knew trouble was coming, Grant opened his front door to find a courier envelope on the mat. Inside was not a thank you letter. It was a notice that Whitaker Grid had launched an internal incident review and reserved the right to pursue claims related to unauthorized emergency access, system exposure, and reputational damage. His own name appeared 3 times before the first page ended. Attached to it was a second document, and signed, offering a private settlement if he agreed to confidentiality. By noon, Naomi had called 7 times. Grant had not answered once. Then, just after 1 o'clock, she showed up in person. No coat worth a fortune this time. No assistant, no polished distance. Only a hard folder under one arm and exhaustion in her face. She told him she had frozen the merger, split with outside counsel, and turned over the buried design history to an independent investigator. She told him the board was preparing to make him the scapegoat anyway. She told him that if he fought, she would stand beside him publicly, even if it cost her the company. Grant listened without inviting her in. Behind him, Sadie stood in the hallway holding her inhaler and watching Naomi with old hurt in her young eyes. The wind had stopped, but the silence on that porch felt sharper than the storm had. Then Sadie asked the one question neither adult could answer quickly. If she stands up for you now, does that erase what she did before? Naomi did not speak. Grant did not either, because that was the real ending no one ever put in the press release. Not whether the heat came back, not whether the children were safe, but whether a person who finally tells the truth after the damage is already visible deserves to be trusted with your future. So tell me this. If you were Grant, would you fight beside Naomi and risk dragging Sadie into a public war? Or would you walk away, protect your daughter's peace, and let the people in power bury the truth one more time?